It's really, we need to understand the landscape. We need to understand, and what I heard from this morning's discussion is there's a lot out there, and how do we get our arms around that? That's really what we need to think about, and it's really about understanding the landscape so that we know what to think about, and how to think about these things. What is it? What are the things that as auditors I need to be alert to? What are the types of questions I need to ask? Those type of things. And I think once we have a better understanding of that, then we can start asking the question, well, what does that mean for standard setting? What does that mean in terms of the auditor's responsibilities? What does that mean in terms of enabling the consistent performance of quality audits? And so that is sort of just the context in which I want to frame that. But I think then let's get straight into the questions. You had the questions in the cover note that went out for the session as well. Yes, Natalie, I think we've got them on the slides as well. And I think we can take them in the three groups that are presented. I don't think we necessarily have to go through it question by question. I would like to look at it sort of as a group of questions. And I think if we sort of spend 10 minutes on each group, then we have some time to also just highlight the key themes that we think. So you would see that the first one is very much about technology used to perpetrate frauds. And I think, Ellie, this is very much what you spoke about in the last session as well. And what we really want to gather information is what are the technologies that are being used by companies, and what vulnerabilities are created by those technologies? What are the fraud risks that auditors should be aware of? How are frauds being perpetrated? And I think, Ellie, in your conversation earlier, you mentioned that there's the difference between the tools that fraudsters use and the tools that all of us use. There's a huge gap in between. So I think if we can get some ideas about the type of vulnerabilities that exist in today's environment, the type of fraud risks, which I think also comes through to the type of fraud risk factors that we probably need to be alert to, linked to technology, and how technology can enable actions that are aimed at deceiving or concealing or misleading. So I think with that, I'll open it up. So Natalie, if you can sort of just time us for those blocks of 10 minutes, more or less. So Ellie, I think you are on mute. Ah, there we go.
Yeah, if I may start to talking about the gap, always the world, you always have a cat and mouse situation. You know, the robbers and cops, that will never change. The people that are not savory will always have access to technology and instruments that we, as the general public, does not have. But what is important that we look at it holistically and look at the tools and the legislation, because it's across the whole board. It has to do with education. You can have the best tools in the world, and I think Sandy mentioned it. You need to have access to the information. If you don't have access to the information, any tool that you have that does not have the data, you cannot utilize. So we are dealing with a very fast technology movement, very, very fast. The rate of technology changes that we are seeing is exponential. And therefore, we can never, as legislators, regulators, usage of technology, we cannot catch up. But we have to get to the level that we coordinate all of the groups that we talked about and mentioned, including academia, to make sure that we have the best overall strategy with the standards, with the tools, in order to enable us to fight the fraud. But we'll always be behind. We will always be behind. That will not change.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective that you say the gap is a reality, and it is how best we deal with that. Brian, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, Willie, thank you. And Ellie, good presentation and comments there earlier. The comments I have are a couple. Number one, I think that as a profession, we need to focus on the most important things, the biggest things that are really giving our profession a black eye, right? And I hear too many people, I think, try and cop out by talking about finding all fraud. But we're not getting a bad reputation because Sally stole, $100 out of the petty cash drawer. What we're getting a bad reputation over is the fact that Wirecard lied about $2 billion. We need to focus as a profession on finding material misstatements. Let's stop the silly talk about, we can't find all fraud, it's hard. That sounds like a bunch of crybabies to me. Let's focus on the ones that really hit the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal headlines. Whether it's Olympus and $3 billion, Parmalat and $5 billion, Luckin Coffee, where there was a third of their revenue that was fraudulent. And if you analyze those frauds, I absolutely agree with Ellie. Fraudsters are always going to look to use the latest and greatest technologies to get ahead of us and the authorities. But at the same time, if you look at how did Wirecard happen? Well, they simply provided mailing addresses that didn't go to the banks. That's a 100-year-old fraud. That wasn't technology. If you look at the Commerce Bank fraud, which is now in Austria, half of the bank's assets are missing. What did they do? The auditors just simply let the executives at the banks mail the confirmations, which means they never mailed them. They just created them and pretended like they mailed them. That put the bank in bankruptcy. That half their assets were gone, and it wasn't through the use of any technology other than just telling the auditors, we'll mail them, and they never did. If you look at the Parmalat fraud, Europe's largest fraud ever. All they did was they gave the auditors the fax number to the law firm of Parmalat, and the auditors faxed the confirmations over to the law firm that Parmalat was using, who gave that confirmation over to the executives, who filled it out and faxed it back to the auditors for a 10-year period. And they faked a $4.9 billion bank account balance. A fax machine and giving somebody a fake fax number or a fake mailing address is not real difficult technology. The fact that we didn't actually do the audit step, we asked the client to mail the confirmations for us. This is silly. I mean, these are giving our profession a bad name. When you have Luckin Coffee, how easy is it to check the bank account information? It's a cash business. There's no receivables in a coffee house. A third of the revenue was fraudulent. Let's just check the information correctly. So while I absolutely agree, criminals are going to look for the biggest advantages, I think the thing that's really giving us a bad name, the entire reason why the IAASB is even holding this, is because of the massive material frauds that give us a black eye, where the public says, where were the auditors? They got paid hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars and they missed it. Why aren't we getting better? That's the big question I think we really ought to be focusing on.
Okay. So some of the messages there, Brian, thank you very much for that, is that the type of frauds, and especially these that sort of grab the headlines, if you really get down to what is at the root of that, it is really very simple actions. I mean, there's some complexity maybe behind how some of these transactions are set up, but these are not new things. These are things that are taught in auditing second year auditing at university. This is what you need to look out for. So is there a way that we can use technology? What can technology enable us to look for? I think, Sandy, you spoke a little bit about it in your conversation as well, how you would profile an entire population, that it enables you to actually look at everything. I think, Ellie, you also spoke about it, is read all the data that's available and then make sure that you properly respond to it. So, Sandy, I don't know if you want to come in here?
Sure. Yeah, and maybe I would just share a few thoughts on whether we should focus somehow on the use of technology to try and do alternate audit procedures outside of confirmations. To Brian's point, I totally see the issues on those audit procedures. But if I think about, some of the frauds I've seen happen in history, and maybe I'll just give one quick example. This was from the mid 80s, and it was a financer of vehicle receivables, and they had like 3 different types of financing, so wholesale, retail, and leasing. And at that time in the entity's systems, you could basically have the same vehicle, every vehicle that's produced has a VIN number, a vehicle identification number that's unique to a car. And at that time, a large material fraud occurred at that entity because the company's system simply didn't have a validation check in the technology that said you couldn't finance, you couldn't collateralize more than one loan with the same vehicle ID number. So you had all these fraudulent loans floor planned against, the same VIN collateralizing multiple loans, which, it was fraud. They had these dollars listed as assets that just were not. So to me, that's a great example of a very simple thing that was programmed into their systems that will now never let that happen again. And I think the more thoughtful companies can be about things like that, edits and validations you could put in the systems to help prevent these kind of things, or as auditors, the more thoughtful we can be about how can we verify a balance more directly through the data versus relying on responses to confirms. Because I think a lot of times, even if the confirmations go out properly, you just don't get a response, and then you're kind of struggling with what you can do. I think the more we can take advantage of technology and data to do that, on the simple bank account example, if there's a way to get the actual bank data directly as auditors and then do the comparison ourselves, on a 100% basis, I think these are examples of how we can use technology to better do audit procedures. And, I think we can challenge companies more to be using technology to just have better controls. You think of the manual journal entry piece I was talking about earlier, just one more quick example. More and more companies are automating the segregation of duties around who can prepare and approve a manual entry. And the more that gets done, the better assurance, I think, the better controls a company will have in place that would prevent fraud, because you've then got at least two people involved, in every one of those entries. And, historically, it's been very hit or miss for how much automation is used in that, but it's becoming more and more common now with the ease of tools like bots and things like that you can put in place on top of an existing system to enforce some of those controls. So I think those are the things I think about when I think of ways we can both improve fraud prevention controls and then also improve the procedures we do as auditors.
But the one thing I'd say to that, Sandy, is I don't think any company's ever gone bankrupt because of segregation of duties issues where two clerks were conspiring to steal a few $100,000. I think the thing that's really hurting us as a profession are those material frauds, the ones that are not perpetrated by what I would call the employees, but by the executives, by the people who are doing the massive frauds. And that was why I started confirmation.com 20 years ago. We do get a 100% response rate. We do tie into the bank systems. We've got over 5,000 banks globally, 174 countries is where our service is used. That was exactly why I created my service, was because I knew we were getting terrible response rates and we needed a better service. But if you take your 80s fraud, that's exactly what companies like Inflow and MindBridge are there to address exactly. They could easily run a check to see if somebody was using multiple VIN numbers to get loans. That's why we need to start using that technology. I think the thing that gives us a bad name as a profession, and I love being a CPA, is the fact that short sellers are finding the frauds that we're not. Somebody mentioned it before. I think it was Eli, or maybe somebody else, when they talked about the ACFE. We find, as a profession, external auditors find fraud 4% of the time. We're worse than an accident. Accidents find fraud about double the percentage of time we do. We're 4%. 96% of the time we're missing it. And so we got to start getting better at what we're doing. And let's look at how, the short sellers have No, as you look at an audit, and I work for E&Y and PwC, we have access to the facilities, management team, and the underlying financial statements. Why is it when the short sellers don't have access to management, they don't have access to the underlying financial systems, they don't have access to the facilities, they're the ones uncovering these frauds? Why aren't we implementing the tools and techniques that they're using? That's what we need to start doing as a profession, because my concern for us is if we don't start doing audits better and be the ones that find the fraud, the regulators are going to take away our exclusive right to do audits. And at some point, you're going to have a Google audit or a Tesla audit or a Amazon audit. That's the concern for me, that we will be allowed to do audits, but if we don't get better at it, seriously, we're going to lose the exclusive right to do it.
So maybe let's hone in a little bit on what Brian said now. Why are we, because we're almost asking the question, why are we missing these things? So why is that? Why are we missing these things? Is it because of vulnerabilities that are created by the way technology is used within entities, we're not alert to what we need to look for, we don't know what to look for? Or is it a question of how we execute our procedures? So why are we missing these things?
If I may interject in here, I think that, and I'm going to put a paper on that. You see, the issue that it's not question that auditors are not doing their job right. It's not a question that we don't know what we're doing. It's the function that what we are told to do, in the sense that if you look at the audit, there are limitations. It's the product of audit is the issue, in the sense that there is compression of audit fees. If you look at, for example, we do audit every year on the company, and I'm on a board, public company board. I'm a director on the board, and we look at it. It's a must-have. You need a check mark. I do the audit because I need a check mark. But does it give me any value for the company when I do the audit? No, it does not. And why? Because it is, I'm being asked, do you do any fraud? And of course, if I committed fraud, am I going to say yes or no? I'm going to say, of course, no, I'm not. So it's the product of audit that is the issue. And the reason it's got to that level, it's not the company. The people that are doing it are amazing. They are very smart, but you have time limited on how you're going to do it. And as I said on the standards, we are not following the standards. The standards are saying clearly, find everything. And I just used the example where you have an average size file, average, not a publicly traded company, but an SMB is about 250,000 transactions. And if you're going to do sampling of 20 or 30, you're not going to find it. We did a case where we took a fraud and we injected it into a file of 1 million transactions. When we use the rules-based, we found it at number 31,000. When we put the AI, we found it at number 30. You'll never find it. If you're doing 20 or 30 sampling, you'll never find the fraud. And the amount of data is increasing continuously. And you also have 90% is not structured data. It's unstructured. Invoices and others, contracts. How are we going to do it? So the key is that we have to change the way that the audit is done, not only from technology, but to enable the auditors to provide value added. So it's not just, it's a check mark, but value, rather we are providing value on the operation of the company. And then there'll be no compression on the size of the fees, because that's what is driving it right now. You have time limited to do the audits, and it's not sufficient time to do it properly.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I respond to that, I see Greg had his hand up earlier as well, and David as well. So Greg, I'll ask you first.
Thanks, Willie. So that's my rear-facing camera, so you can't see me. So I apologize for that. I just wanted to, I guess, echo what Brian had said, just in terms of the Canadian public sector, reflecting on recent frauds that I've become aware of in my role in the Canadian federal public sector over the last, say, 5 years. The more significant examples that I could identify were what I would call traditional frauds, in the sense of they were kickbacks, misuse of funds, things that weren't necessarily enabled by technology. So listening to the conversation, I think, is a combination of two things. You know, the auditor needs to take advantage of technology to deal with the volume of transactions that are being recorded, and where technology can assist the identification of issues such as those suggested by Sandra. But also the auditor needs to be trained in human nature. Yeah. The ability to understand the traditional ways by which companies can either misrepresent results or assets can be misappropriated. I mean, that's a traditional skill that perhaps needs a refresher in the audit profession, particularly when we have more and more digital transaction processing and things like digital banking or digital currency, which have enabled the ability to shift transactions from one ledger to another or from one account to another completely undetected. You know, like you can steal an individual's identity, change their banking information with respect to an organization, and then suddenly a legitimate transaction that was intended for one individual goes to somebody else, which is what we're seeing in the COVID crisis. So I think those technologies, digital banking, increased use of robotic processing, automation, which are allowing high volumes of transactions to be processed without human intervention, are perhaps the opportunities. But the response is, you know, the auditor needs to use technology to detect mismatches, unusual entries, etc., but also be aware of human nature and how these frauds are conducted in the first place.
Okay, thank you, Greg. And I think you touched on a very important point there in terms of behavior as well. You know, human behavior, being alert to that, how people behave and what they do and not do, or what they would be expected to do and they don't do it. That in itself can be a source of information. David, you've had your hand up for quite a while, so please come in.
Thanks, Willie. I'm David Lipper-Smith. I'm a technical manager at ICAASB. I work in our tech faculty, but sit alongside the folks that we have that support the fraud advisory panel. So followed this with some interest, and I think something that I was thinking, coming from what Brian was saying, that I think is very true, that many of the actual mechanics of the frauds that we're seeing working have not really changed as technology has changed. You know, people are still using them to carry out things like pyramid schemes, which are hundreds or thousands of years old. There were two different sets of cryptocurrencies that were called Ponzi coin, that were Ponzi schemes. So these were, you know, there's no great surprise in, you know, how these work, and the people keep falling for them because of the human nature points that I think Greg was touching on. Where I think technology makes a difference is that it adds power to either the breadth or the depth of these attacks. And so what we've seen is either that, you know, we're seeing technology makes it so that you can make very broad, very simple attempts at fraud. And this is where things like spam email come in, where you can send an extremely unsophisticated fraudulent message to hundreds of thousands of people and hope that you hit a few. Or the more recent social engineering and spear phishing types of attacks, where it's again a confidence trick that is not anything new in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, in terms of targeting the person, but what technology difference does make is that you have a humongously increased power of how you can research that person, how well you can impersonate their manager, or how well you can research what will perhaps appear correct to them, or go trawling through their social media to try and find details that are pertinent to their security questions, and trying to figure out things like that. So I think that the mechanics of the frauds aren't particularly new, but technology does make a difference in terms of those approaches. And I think that's where, as auditors, we have to be thinking about, where these kinds of things might be happening when they're coming from outside the company, and if things are coming from inside the company as well.
Okay. So in terms of what you refer to as the breadth and depth of the attacks, and actually the message I got from that is that you almost got the sense, although it's the same at its core, it's the same types of frauds we see. Because of technology, they can get lost in this volume of things that's going on. The volume of transactions, the volume of information, and that's where really came in and said, but we're able to read that volume of information. What are the characteristics we're looking for? Sandy, I think you also pointed out some of the ways in which you pinpoint certain characteristics you're looking for, and that's to draw out some of these things. Alexander, and I know your background is more from a forensic point of view, and I would be very interested to hear your take on this as well. And maybe even one of the specific things I want to ask from a forensic point of view is, we all realize that the forensic audit in its purpose and setup is completely different from a financial statement audit. But what are the things that financial statement auditors can learn from the forensic world, and that we can apply to make our procedures maybe a little bit more focused, a little bit more effective in terms of knowing what we need to look for, how to draw out the right information, that type of thing?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. As you might know, it's public knowledge, I think, that I did the Wirecard investigation. So I was carefully listening to all the speakers today, and also in this group. And I think even if they used old schemes, they used technology. And they use technology also for cover traces, for doing the communication and fooling the auditors. And I think a proper understanding of technology, it's very much important. But on the other side, relying only on technology, it's also the wrong way. If you look at a financial statement auditor who says, I got everything into my data and I can draw a conclusion just from the data, and the data looks good, everything calculated, and everything is fine, everything is green, without thinking of where the data come from, and are they genuine, what is the authorization, what is the proper provided by entity procedures and stuff like that, and without looking at the environment, you just have data, and they might tell the truth. I'm a computer scientist by profession, so I love data, but without looking at the surroundings, without looking at the human behavior, which one of the workshop members outlined very properly, you probably get lost and not seeing the real problem. And if you take a step back, which we actually doing during a forensics audit, and asking ourselves, does it fit together? Is it is the whole picture, is it right or is it not right? What are the things you discovered below materiality and all the stuff then you probably get the answer where you have to look for. And if everything looks right, then I'm getting suspicious. I think that's the thing. And what we are seeing within financial statement audits, sometimes the auditor might lose his skepticism because he needs to meet a timeline. He needs to get comfy with the client. He needs to think about other stuff and not really looking into the real problem, and does it really fit together what he's seeing. And sometimes someone might not looking into the proper standards and not following the proper rules, and then all those small workarounds piled at the end of the day into a huge problem, which you cannot fight after several years of doing an audit. And then sometimes you have to step back and see, oh, is it really right what I'm doing here, what I'm seeing here? And I would say data is just one source of an investigation or a forensic audit. It's just one source. The other sources are background information, people, and documents. And if you look at documents and contracts and all those things we talked about, the fraudsters using technology, falsifying documents, falsifying emails, falsifying contracts, chat protocols, video calls, voice messages, stuff like that. And we have to identify those manipulations on the electronic data. So following blind to an electronic trail could lead you in a wrong direction if you're not looking constantly at your evidence. So it's easy to say for a forensic auditor because we have all the time we need and we have all the budget we need. But from my point of view, sometimes it's very important to have this outside view into a standard financial statement audit, to have someone who looks below the maturity, below the evidence the audit team gathered, and below the perfectly fit environment, which might have some hole for fraudster.
Thank you, Alexander. And I think Sandy made a point earlier in terms of that, you know, we need to engage with the data more directly. Technology allows us to do that. It allows us to look at all of the population. I think what Alexander has also highlighted is that's fine, and those are the capabilities we must utilize, but we also have to look at it in the context of the environment, in the context of the human behavior, and ask the question, does this look right? Is it almost a smell test? Does this smell right? Is there something wrong here? And I get it's even that sometimes if everything does look right, that's actually when you need to be concerned. But Sandy, do you find in terms of the techniques that you are using, does the fact that you are able to use technology to engage more directly with the data, does that allow you to be a little bit more focused when you look at this bigger picture as well? So you are on mute, Sandy.
Yeah, I clicked it off on my Jabra, but not on the laptop. Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it does let us be much more focused. You know, we can profile transactions, we can brainstorm ideas of what we think specific fraud schemes might be related to a specific account balance, and then we can run tests specific to that on full population. So when we're able to get the entity's data, I think it definitely helps the audit process in terms of increasing efficiency and really letting us target, you know, what we're focusing in on in our testing.
Willie, if I may add, when we look at how to protect, there is a number of line of defense that we have to look at. We do know there are errors. Errors occur, but in reality, fraud is perpetrated by human. So how do you take the human out of the equation? So we have three lines of defense as far as I see it. One is the internal control, the internal auditors, the CFO, and so on. And clearly, it will break down when you do have people inside the company that are going to, especially the executives, that are going to commit fraud. The second line of defense is, right now, what we're doing is the auditor. The way that I see it, we have to change it. The second line of defense is the technology, the automation, and we're going to see a lot more automation. And we're going to see, especially with AI, where you have a lot of know-how into the technology. We already have over 14 billion data points, and we'll have trillions of data points to enable you to detect what is normal and what is not normal. And the third line of defense is the auditors that are you going to utilize and understand this technology with their knowledge and with their capabilities and insight and the brilliance that they have to finalize, to interpret what the technology is giving them to identify the issues. But if we're going to do it the other way, we're going to continue to suffer. We have to utilize the technology is the tool that the auditors have to utilize to enable them to do a better job in an environment where the amount of data is just too big for any individual to manage.
Okay. There's one last question that I just want to come back to before our session ends, and that is, Alexander made the point that we must never forget that a fraudster is out to manipulate. He's out to deceive, to falsify, all of that. So what can we teach an auditor what to look for? What will the telltale signs be of manipulation, deceit? Is it possible to do that? Or is it to an extent already what we're doing, Sandy, when you refer to looking for certain characteristics in a data set? Yes, Brian?
Yeah, on that, I think is we have to really start with it at the college and university level. You know, it's not in the curriculum. It's not in the curriculum because it's not on the test. In order to pass the CPA exam or even the chartered accountant exam, on the CPA exam, it's less than 0.1% of the questions deal with fraud. So we teach to the test because we want our students to pass. So there was no training in college or university. It's not on the test that we take, and there's no continuing education requirement for fraud. And yet, in my state where I'm licensed, which is in Texas, I have a 4-hour requirement mandatory every year on ethics. Ethics shouldn't change annually. In fact, it should be pretty consistent. In fact, I pretty much just take the test every year because it is the same year after year. But fraud techniques change every single year. And yet there's no requirement in continuing education on fraud education. That's where we've got to get serious. The public looks at us as the watchdogs. Technology, Excel and calculators do a real good job of adding up columns of numbers these days. And sure, we want to make sure that the financial statements are presented fairly in accordance with the standards. But at the end of the day, if that's all we're doing, we really shouldn't get paid what we're getting paid. We need to find fraud, the material fraud, but we've got to start with educating our students and then our staff on how fraud happens and where it's occurring.
Okay. So again, so one of the strong messages that I got out of this discussion is clearly the technology, and the technology is there, and it sounds, especially if we listen to some of the panelists as well, these things are being used today, but a lot behind that is also about human behavior. It's also about the right skill set, and all those things actually need to come together. I think, Eli, what you said at the beginning is that we need to coordinate. We need to coordinate all these things to have the best possible approach. Okay, I think we're at the end of the session. Natalie, I must say, I don't know what's going to happen next. Are we all just going to disappear, or or this whole?
So Billy, what should be happening is we will all be transferred back to the main conference once our time is up. But according to my side, I think we still have 3 more minutes from the clock.
Okay. So can we sort of start maybe recapping? And Natalie, I know we're going to have a few minutes to do that as well. I don't know where we do it. Are me and you going to stay in this room, or are we also going to go back to the main room?
Billy, we will also go back to the main room, but I can just reach out to you through Teams, if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine.
We are being told to proceed for the last 3 minutes. So if there's anything further, sorry, I was just checking because my time said 3 extra minutes.
So maybe if I run around, sort of, what is the key message? Ellie, if I can start with you.
We need to close the gap between what the fraudsters are using, the tools that they're using, and what we as a whole, and holistically, when I say we, is the royal we, that's the regulators, these are the accounting firm, these are the forensic, these are the technology, and academia. And Brian is right, we have to look at academia and teach that, and obviously what this organization is doing right now, all of that together to have a united front to combat fraud.
Okay, I'm just taking the people in the order that are on my screen. Sandy?
I'm sorry, what was that?
So just sort of as a closing, what would you
Sure.
think is a key message?
Yeah, my key message would be we need to use technology more and more and more on the audits to do 100% testing and, you know, take advantage of that because it's becoming more and more commonplace, and it helps create efficiency for the audit and lets us focus on what really matters.
Okay, yeah, that can enable that. Okay, then the next person on my screen is Brian.
Yeah, I would just say that as a profession, we need to own our responsibility to find material misstatements due to fraud. You know, when you look at the fact that the chair of the firm that missed the patisserie Valerie fraud was quoted in the newspaper saying it's not our responsibility to find fraud, it's the tone at the top. Those people need to retire from our profession and move on because we're letting the public down.
Okay. That's a strong message. Thank you. Then David?
I think very similarly to Brian, and also I think the point is that technology is improving and changing. We do need to keep up with that, but at the same time, you can't make an anti-fraud system that is, there's a limit on how strong you can make that system, and that limit is how gullible the person is who is inside and has the power to make payments. So long as you have a credulous person who is, making payments or doing audits, it doesn't matter how good your security is if they can be duped into doing something that they shouldn't.
Okay. Then Greg?
Thanks, Willie. I would just add one thing we haven't talked about, but I think it'd be interesting to separate theft from management reporting, from improper management reporting, to help focus, either the education or the audit techniques or the authoritative guidance, whatever it happens to be, because I think auditors sometimes, mix everything together, and I think it's easier to address auditors' response to fraud